Thank you very much for coming in this dreadful weather. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce Professor Len Goodman. This is Professor Goodman's third trip to JTS, at least on my watch. I don't know if he was here before that. But Len is really an unusual, I think, very, very important figure in the various realms of contemporary philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and the history of philosophy. Philosophy, like every other academic discipline, is heavily segmented. People tend to burrow down into their own little subsections and tend their professional gardens. But Professor Goodman has expertise and authority across a much wider range of fields than is usually the case in today's academic culture. He is a leading scholar of medieval Muslim philosophy and Arabist, and of Jewish philosophy. Usually historians of philosophy don't actually do philosophy, but he is at the same time a leading philosopher, having written purely philosophical books such as In Defense of Truth, for example. And he's a Jewish philosopher. He's certainly one of the leading people in the world today who are advancing constructive, creative, deeply learned Jewish philosophy. So he has a very synoptic, synthetic vision of a great deal of power expressed in many, many books with a very vivid and literary prose. If you read, professional philosophy like I do, you know how absolutely weird and unusual this is. If you don't, maybe you can't appreciate it, but believe me, it's really something special. So Professor Goodman was educated at Harvard and at Oxford University. His philosophical interests center on metaphysics and ethics, and he's paid special attention over the years to Islamic and Jewish philosophical thought and their creative interactions. He was the winner of the American Philosophical Association Baumgart Memorial Prize, as well as being the recipient of Vanderbilt University, where he teaches, of their top research award. His books span a very broad range. His most recent book is called Creation and Evolution, which is a study of philosophy of biology and its religious dimensions. Routledge, 2010. Oxford published in 2009 a critical edition and new translation from the Arabic of the 10th century ecological fable called The Case of the Animals versus Man before the King of the Jinn. In 2009, the University of Chicago Press published Tufail Hai Ibn Yaqzan. Oxford University Press published in 2008 his Gifford Lectures from 2005, Love Thy Neighbor as Thyself. In 2003, Oxford University Press published Islamic Humanism, and I could go on in this vein. You get the idea, but I don't want to cheat him of his time. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, and our topic today is holiness. Len.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be back here at JTS, institution very dear to both of us, I know. The topic today is holiness, and I have several things to say about it. Start with the centrality of the idea of holiness in our lives as people who are committed to Judaism. The word holy first occurs in the Torah when God ceases his work on the seventh day and sanctifies the seventh day by Kadesh Oto. It's something we make reference to frequently, and we are supposed to participate in that sanctification with kiddush, with wine and challah and so forth. we participate more constantly in the regular Hebrew prayers, fulfilling the mitzvah l'kadesh et shimcha barabim, to sanctify God's name in public. That's why we need a minyan to say Kaddish, and we say the Kaddish to celebrate and thank God for the lives of those who have been dear to us, and even for completing a unit of prayer or study. We speak of martyrs, not using that frame, that term that Arabs use, shahid, which is a literal calque on the Christian Greek term martyros, a witness, but rather we say that someone who died rather than desecrate God's name, or even simply because that person was a Jew, we say that that person has died al kiddush Hashem, and in sanctification of God's name. And we say further, expressing that distinctive Jewish interest in life being more important than death, and the focus on life that we have, that's so much a part of our culture. We say better even to live al kiddush Hashem, to live for the sanctification of God's name, than to die that way. When we marry, the bridegroom says to the bride, Hareyat mikudeshet li, you are sanctified to me, or set aside for me. And in that very ancient formula, we can see some of the roots of that meaning of kiddush, which means something which is separate and set aside, and, as one might say in the contemporary idiom, special. Another appearance of that root, which goes back very, very anciently, in that word kadesha. Kadesha is a prostitute. We read that in last week's Torah Parsha about Judah thinking that his daughter-in-law was a kadesha, and the word recurs again later on in Leviticus when mention is made of the apparent use of temple prostitutes in pagan cults, kadesh and kadesha. Something from which the Torah wants us to remove ourselves. That's in Deuteronomy, not in Leviticus. But again, you can see the root meaning of that term, that root, kuf daled shin, there, because those persons were devoted, as it were, to that pagan cult. That is, they were set aside, we would say, not in a good way. Most of the usage of that root in our culture and in our religion is in a more positive sense, reflecting Abraham's discovery that greatness is not to be equated with horror, that power is not the same as violence. And the point at which Abraham discovers that is at the Ekkedah, the binding of Isaac, because we read as the moral that the Torah draws explicitly from that story, that this was the place where God revealed himself. You remember the play on words in the story of the binding of Isaac, where Isaac asks about where the lamb for the sacrifice is, and Abraham says, well, God will take care of that. But the phrase he uses in the Hebrew, and it's important to pay attention to the Hebrew there, is that God will see to it. And that see to it comes back in a kind of turned around form at the punchline of the story, where the mountain is called Har HaMoriah, the place where God is seen. So the seeing turns out to be a theophany. It turns out to be God's revelation of himself and of his true nature to Abraham and all of his descendants and successors and followers, that we get the revelation of God's true nature through the recognition that it's not human sacrifice that God desires, but goodness, not violence, violence and power are not the same. Greatness and horror are not the same. That's a momentous revelation, and it's through that revelation that all the nations of the world in that passage are said to be blessed. People who work in religious studies and want to think about holiness have an unfortunate handicap, because the scholar Rudolf Otto, many decades ago, wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy. And in that book, and you know, generally, if you take a religion course, you're going to get stuck reading that book. The point of that book is to sunder the connection that Abraham discovers, the unity that God reveals between goodness and holiness, to separate those two ideas once again. Otto, in a romantic and almost neo-pagan sort of way, wants to say that the numinous, the sense of the presence of the divine, what we would call the Shekhinah, is a sense of what he calls the mysterium tremendum, the mystery that makes you quake. And he says very explicitly that it's nothing to do with rationality and nothing to do with generosity, nothing to do with goodness. In fact, it's a sense of horror at the presence of the divine. I think that that if you study very, very ancient pagan piety, you'll find that that sense of the numinous could be good, could be bad. Any kind of presence that seems momentous and important and overwhelming is regarded as a manifestation of the divine in the experience of pagan piety. But the revolutionary attainment that Judaism represents and that is ascribed to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham, the patriarch, is the recognition that those negativities are not part of God. The coherence of the monotheistic idea of God rests upon the unity of the virtues and the connectedness of all good things, and the exclusion from that goodness of ideas of violence and violation, which had been in pagan piety connected with them. There are three seeming paradoxes about the idea of holiness as we use it in Judaism, as opposed to that sort of neo-pagan and romantic idea that people might have experienced through reading Rudolf Otto's book. And I wanted to focus on those three seeming paradoxes today, and show you why I think and how I think that they can be resolved and are resolved in our tradition. The paradox about where the holiness resides is the first. The second is about who attains holiness, and the third about how holiness is attained. The where question arises in concerns about whether holiness is near or remote, because of that root idea of the transcendence that the idea of holiness suggests to us, the idea of being set apart and special. And one could document that at enormous length. I mentioned a few biblical occurrences, but those of you who study Talmud know, for example, that with holy things, one can always promote and elevate. One isn't supposed to denigrate. So if you've got a cabinet that you've used for an Aron Kodesh, you can't convert it to an ordinary bookcase or a liquor cabinet, or as my part of the world where I live, a gun cabinet. Not permissible. You can always elevate, but you can't denigrate in terms of holiness. And there you can see some of the dynamic of that concept. So we know that holiness means set apart, and set apart in a good way. But the question is, of course, how then can we connect with holiness? And there have been plenty of philosophers who accuse Judaism of setting the divine so far apart from human experience that the divine becomes inaccessible. That's a pretty standard Christian polemical criticism of Judaism, because they have a mediator and we, we're sort of on our own. We're We hope to be with God, but they raise a question about how that could be. The second paradox about who is to attain holiness, if this is a goal for human beings. Is it the individual or is it the community? That tension between the individual and the autonomous individual and the kahal, the community. That's a second set of issues. And the third one, how holiness is attained, which I think relates to the nexus between the moral life and the spiritual life. Is holiness sheerly a moral matter? Is it a matter of some kind of spiritual experience or outreach from God to us, from us to God? Abraham Joshua Heschel, who taught here at this institution, wrote a famous book. Many of you have read it, God in Search of Man. They're reversing the polarities of that kind of agnostic idea, again, a romantic idea that man is kind of at sea and looking for God. So let me start with that issue of immanence versus transcendence. It's pretty clear in the biblical tradition that holiness does draw a line. There's a line drawn between Sabbaths and weekday pursuits. There's a line between days of holy assembly and workaday life. There's the land between the place where Moses is standing. He's told to take off his sandals because this is holy ground. Something special about this, something set apart at the burning bush. The Kohanim are people who are set apart, the priests of Israel. The offerings that are reserved to them are also set apart, and there's a host of regulations about that. So we know that holiness means special in the sense of separate. The idea that Israel as a nation is to become a nation set apart, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, as it says in Exodus. It's by keeping God's commandments that Israel is expected to attain that station, and the way of life prescribed in those commandments, and this is where the paradox comes in, is said not to be at a remove. The famous lines from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. It's not too marvelous for you. It's not remote. It's not in the heavens, as if to say, who will go up to the heavens for us and get it for us? And let us hear it, that we may do it. And it's not across the sea, as if to say, who will cross the sea for us and get it for us? And let us hear it, that we may do it. In fact, that's the key in the passage. In fact, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, ready to perform, la soto, ready to perform. It's like it's brought right to us. So holiness is at once set apart and immediate, distant, transcendent, and present, imminent. As I mentioned to a couple of you just before we began, friends and I have been working on Shir HaShirim right now, the Song of Songs. And there's a marvelous passage which is quoted in the Talmud where Rabbi Akiva said, "No day since time began was as precious as the day Israel received the Song of Songs. All the scriptures are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies." You wonder at first, how can one holy thing be holier than another? And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah explained it, that it was like setting apart. You bring some wheat to the miller, and you tell the miller to take off the chaff and then take off the coarser parts and leave you the creme de la creme, the finest of the wheat. That's how Azariah explains, Elazar ben Azariah explains what Rabbi Akiva meant. Now, many people who read the Song of Songs believe that it's just a collection of love songs, and that when it refers to the Song of Songs, they don't take that title to be that kind of a song beyond all songs, but they take it to mean just an anthology, a song made up of other songs. That's a friend and I have been reading Yefet Ben Eli's Karaite commentary, and he says that it's a collection. It's pretty clear that it is a collection, but I don't think that Rabbi Akiva was missing the point when he played on that expression to take it in a much deeper sense. What Rabbi Akiva sees and points out when he plays on the words in the song's title is that the Song of Songs is not an ordinary song bag. Its tropes, of course, are erotic, but in every sacred sphere of life and avenue of activity, including the erotic, meanings are what we bring to what we do. Exegetes today tend to divide the house and tear their hair very frequently, not so much their own hair, but the other guy's hair. Some taking it to be very secular and insisting on showing that there are erotic themes in the Song of Songs, which should be pretty obvious, and others getting very huffy about that and regarding it as an allegory which excludes and denies those erotic themes. Both those extremes, of course, are very wrong and very wrong-headed. I think what's most striking in Rabbi Akiva's glowing endorsement, ringing endorsement of the sanctity of the Song of Songs is his recognition that that's a false dichotomy. It's not either erotic or mystical. What's striking to him regarding it as something which is both erotic and mystical is that there's a remarkable aptness in mapping divine love on the love which is expressed in human passions. There's a parallel issue which I find instructive. The great Jewish philosopher, the first Jewish philosopher, Philo, back a little before the beginning of the Common Era, famously described philosophy as the handmaid of theology. Ancilla was the Greek word he used. Philosophy is the handmaid of theology. And people get very offended like that. Oh, he's putting philosophy in a subordinate position. But I think the remarkable thing about Philo is that it was philosophy that he put in that position and not literary studies or historical studies or anything else. And similarly here, I think the remarkable thing about the erotic imagery of the Song of Songs and the way people have read it in various phases of our tradition is that it was the erotic that they thought this is the highest phase of human bodily passion and emotional passion, and therefore the most appropriate way of talking symbolically about our connection as individuals or as a community with God. Akiva apparently sees no tug of war between the earthly love and the heavenly love. Plato had seen a kind of progression in Plato's famous dialogue, The Symposium. He sees a progression from earthly love to heavenly love. You've sort of got to leave the one behind in order to get to the other. That's not the way our tradition sees it. The way our tradition sees it, there's a unity and an expressivity, and there's a natural symbolism of the one in the other. So that the allegory, if it is an allegory, is embedded in the nature of things. Thus, the symbolism very much connects with the idea of our embodiment, that human beings become souls because we have bodies. You can see that expressed biblically when Adam has the stunning epiphany and realizes he's been looking all over for his counterpart, and he finally finds it in Eve, and you have that wonderful anti-misogynistic line where Adam draws the moral of the story and says of Eve that she is bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, that their community and their unity and their complementarity is expressed in the physical. Similarly, that wonderful line in the book of Proverbs, 3 things are too marvelous for me, and 4 perhaps that I cannot fathom. The way of an eagle through the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the heart of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. The erotic there taken as something miraculous, like the fact that an eagle can fly or that a ship can sail. But at the same time, with that miraculousness is brought down to earth. The serpent on the rock, the man with the maid. God's laws are not too marvelous. His will and intent are not out of reach. They're not unfathomable. God's will is doable, not beyond us. We're commanded to pursue holiness and to become, in that respect, like God. That, of course, a core commandment in the Torah, Leviticus 19:2, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. God is transcendent and thus beyond our reach, not to be seen, never to be portrayed, not to be likened to any celestial or terrestrial or chthonic being. How then do God's laws put God's holiness within our reach? We're not supposed to suspend our judgment. We're not supposed to surrender in stupefaction to the incommensurability of the infinite with the finite. Isaiah, and it is Isaiah, writing in a visionary mode, not in the usual philosophical idiom, Isaiah cuts the knot between the transcendent sense of the divine and the immanent sense of the divine. And it's in a line that occurs in our regular worship. God hears the angels in his vision crying out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord of hosts, the fill of all the earth is his glory." Please notice how I translated that. Not the whole earth is full of his glory, which Ibn Ezra proposed as a way of untangling the language, but taking it literally. The fill of all the earth is his glory. Malokal haaretz kavodo. Notice the way the 2 lines, the 2 hemistiches as they call them, balance one another. Kugel points out in his book on biblical poetry that he goes by the name of Kaduri now. He's given up on Kugel, but he points out that the parallelism in Hebrew poetry is not a matter of just repeating what was said before, but of adding something that wasn't there before. And in this particular example, we can see a lot more than just addition or specification. Holy here does mean transcendent. It's the standard biblical word for transcendent. But in Isaiah's vision, what the angels are recognizing, our liturgy pictures them actually asking one another, where does God's glory dwell? The word glory, kivodo, his glory, is the standard biblical word for God's manifestation, God's presence, where God would be seen, like glory would be something that would be visible. Some of the medieval philosophers actually imagined God manifesting his glory as a visible expression. Kavod, if you take it very literally, actually means weight. So it's not just visible, it's ponderable, it's tangible. The answer to the question that the angels in our liturgy ask is that God's manifestation is the creation that we see around us. That's making explicit what was told to us in Bereshit, because God manifests himself by creating this world. Finitude is the expression of infinitude, and that's the most central metaphysical idea in our religion. And what Isaiah is saying there is, don't think that God's transcendence excludes God from presence. On the contrary, God's manifestation is what you see around you. Look at the beauty, look at the goodness, look at the truth, look at the unity that is present in reality. That's where God expresses himself, and realize that the infiniteness and the transcendence of God took finite form in this world, in this created world, in nature as we see it. You can see the logic of that idea if you recognize the idea that God is infinite. Because if God is infinite, God's transcendence consists in his infiniteness and not in his apartness. So God is beyond what we can know and touch and feel and smell, but at the same time, if infinite, present in it as well. Spinoza is one philosopher who grasps a corner of this idea that God's transcendence is not at odds with his immanence. So Spinoza interprets God's transcendence as the fact that there are infinite attributes of God that we couldn't possibly know, and all those attributes are themselves infinite. We can know only matter and form, thought and extension, as he says it, because that's something that we have something in common with. But the absoluteness of God would not know any bounds, and yet it would not be divorced from the reality that we do know. Second paradox, or apparent paradox, personal or communal. Israel is commanded to emulate God's holiness, often in plural terms, but very much more frequently in singular terms. The second person singular is a typical form of a commandment. How is it that we can somehow communally attain the goal that's laid out for us if this is supposed to be achieved by personal means, that each individual does this, and yet it's Israel that's supposed to become a nation of priests and a holy nation? Our task is to become as like God as we can, but we don't do that by tzimtzum. There's no mitzvah of tzimtzum. We're not supposed to make ourselves smaller and accommodate in the way that God accommodates to us. We're not supposed to emulate God's ipsiety or God's essiety or any of those wonderful medieval qualities that God has. What we're supposed to do, as the rabbis explain, has its roots in the ethical sphere. As it says, the question, how can one who is flesh and blood follow the Shekhinah, Shekhinah being God's manifestation? That is, how can mortal human beings emulate God's presence in the world? And the rabbis answer, one has to say it means follow the law, emulate the perfections of the Holy One. As he clothed the naked, so do thou clothe the naked. As he comforted the mourners, so do thou comfort the bereaved. As he buried the dead, so do thou bury the dead. That's in Sota 14a in the Talmud. Moral commandments become a way of emulating God, and the rabbis midrashically pick out those incidents of where God made clothing for Adam and Eve when they were expelled from the garden, or where God comforted Isaac on the death of Abraham, or when God personally buried Moses so that no one would find and venerate his grave. We emulate God, in other words, through chesed. Chesed is a divine attribute. It means grace. It means generosity. It means kindness. We often translate it as loving kindness. Those are ways that are immediately accessible to us of emulating God. Saja, the great philosopher of the 10th century, says that the act of creation is an act of grace because it answered to no previous desert. There wasn't anything around to have any expectations or requirements or claims upon God. And in that respect, God's grace is infinite. We can't touch the infiniteness of that, but we can be creative and we can be generous, and these are means that are accessible to us. How do we connect personal moral qualities with social qualities that would enable us to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, which I take it is a reference to the ethos that we're supposed to acquire as a people. How is personal self-transformation supposed to lead to communal redemption and transformation, in fact, of the world, by which we are made a blessing to all the nations of the world? I think, as with all things human, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing this. The wrong way is by a kind of dogmatic enforcement, by the legalism that you find typified in say, Justinian's code, the motto of which is sum cuique dare, to give to each his own. That idea of reciprocity, which is a good legal ideal, the rabbis condemn as midat Sodom. Somebody who says what's mine is mine and what's thine is emulating not God, but the ethos of Sodom, midat Sodom. How so? Well, they wanted to keep everything that was their own for themselves and not be generous. Too often, I think, when we think in terms of the social gospel, if you accept that, forgive that expression, that is of boiling down and reducing our spiritual obligations to moral terms, taking religion to be simply a matter of morality. What happens next in that dialectic is very revealing. We use what I like to call the accusatory we. That is, we say, we are not doing enough to help the people with AIDS or malaria. We are not doing enough about global warming. Have you ever noticed that the we in those sentences tends to point a finger? We, meaning you, are not doing what you should be doing. And then that leads immediately to a kind of offloading of personal responsibility onto social agencies, onto the government should be doing this. Other people should be doing it. It's not really about myself. People like to say that charity begins at home, meaning that one should heed one's own preferences and comforts first and then think about others. Charity then would turn out to mean something more like getting rather than giving. So there must be a wisdom in the Jewish precept that even those who receive charity are required to give it. Too often the reduction of holiness to generosity means offloading responsibilities onto social agencies, as I said, and it gets pretty self-righteous, turning holiness into Abu Ben Adam's virtue of loving his fellow man, and that in turn into the expectation that others will take care of that fellow man. That's what I would say is the bad way of trying to socialize holiness as a virtue. I'm more attracted to the Jewish idea of the hand up rather than the hand out, the Maimonidean idea that the highest charity is to help another get on his feet and become self-sufficient. After all, charity in Hebrew is tzedakah, justice, doing the right thing. And it's no coincidence that in Hebrew, saints are called tzaddikim, right? Often very flatly translated as righteous people. It doesn't mean righteous people at all. It means saints. Translate for the reference in this sense, not for the etymology. Tzaddikim are people who perform chesed, acts of grace, act of kindness, acts of generosity. The right way to pursue our emulation of God's generosity is to expect nothing in return. That's what Antigonus of Socho was referring to, as quoted in Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, when he said, don't be like servants serving the master for the sake of a gratuity. Pras is a gratuity in ancient terms. But like servants who serve the master without regard to a reward, but imbued with the awe of heaven. And here again you have to translate the idiom. Doing something for the awe of heaven means doing it for its intrinsic good, doing it because it's the right thing in the eyes of God, which means the right thing in absolute terms. Abaya used to say, one should be subtle about the awe of heaven, remembering that a soft answer turneth away wrath. as it tells us in Proverbs. One should be on the friendliest of terms with his brethren and everyone else, including the non-Jew in the street, so as to be beloved of heaven, well-liked on earth, and admired by others. That's again in the Talmud, Brachot 17a. Awe of heaven there interpreted in moral terms. Spinoza is helpful in seeing how that personal ethical commitment transforms itself socially. He makes a distinction in the ethics between humanitas, which means humanity, human-heartedness, humaneness. He distinguishes humanitas from ambitio. And the distinction is important because both of those characteristics come from the same root, our desire to please others. But some people want to please others to win favor, to be admired, to get something in return. Intent makes all the difference. People who want to please others for those self-serving reasons are committed to what Spinoza calls ambitio, ambition. In Latin, that doesn't mean gumption. Ambitio in Latin was a crime. It meant, walking around canvassing to buy votes. It was against the law. And that's the term that Spinoza uses for the desire to help others and serve others out of self-interest. Humanitas, on the other hand, Spinoza equates with pietas. So he recognizes that connection through the Hebrew idea of chesed, because chesed is the standard term for piety, and chesed is expressed in generosity, which is what humanitas means, what chesed means. What we learn from Spinoza's analysis of the dynamics of that kind of behavior is that the kind of moral imperialism or triumphalism that wants to try and make others like oneself and win them over in that sense naturally engenders hatred. That's the fruits of dogmatism, that's the fruits of moral imposition and spiritual imposition, whereas kindness is correspondingly contagious, as we know. Love spreads when we see in one another a genuine regard for one another's genuine and individual and personal interests and concerns. That's what builds communities and makes them strong and transforms our potential for antipathy into love. So we can see Spinoza here as a very committed exegete and not as the usual familiar role of Bible critic and gadfly, bringing his insight to bear on the biblical anatomy and dynamic of the idea of chesed. And he shows that Mandeville wasn't entirely right in his cynical notion about the fable of the bees, that private vice can become public virtue. On the contrary, private virtue can become public virtue. Third paradox, and we've just got a few minutes before we open it up for conversation. I mentioned the Abu Ben Adam ideal. The truth behind that notion of loving one's fellow man is the recognition that piety is empty without that kind of love. But Judaism grounds the love of our fellow human beings in their intrinsic worth, and thus in the love of God, whose image shines in the human face. Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher of the last century, wrote extensively about the human face. And the first thing the human face says is, don't kill me. But it really says a lot more than that. Don't ignore me. Don't ignore my individuality. Don't erase me from your world. Theism and humanism in this respect, in our tradition, are not rivals, but they're one another's complements. We learn of God's absoluteness by contemplating the strictness of our moral obligations, and we learn of the insistence of every desert and the absoluteness of human rights and the inestimable worth of every human claim by contemplating God's creative acts, God's grace, God's chesed. The familiar prying apart of the claims of God and humanity is a ploy of Enlightenment secularity. The intent was honorable. The intent was to free human claims from the demands of oppressive hierarchies and that threatened the very spirit that they were supposed to be, that they were pledged and mandated to sustain. But the effect was devastating, for without the nexus to the divine, human claims were no better than mere demands. Jeremy Bentham expressed that well when he called rights nonsense and imprescriptible absolute rights nonsense on stilts. Rights in Bentham's world were just claims, and you go to law or you go to force or you go to self-help of some form or another. That's how you get your rights, and rights that aren't regulated by law are fictions. Bentham hated fictions because he had a nurse who used to frighten him with stories about ghosts. Without an absolute to underwrite and underscore and indeed give definition and delineation to the claims of subjecthood and personhood, rights become just one more commodity in the marketplace, just one more bone of contention in the law courts. And the impact of that secularization is still being pressed today in the effort to shift concern for human health, that of others and even our own, from an imprescriptive claim to an economic charge. So spectator sports are sacrosanct, but rising health care costs are a scandal and a terrible thing. Young doctors are told as part of their training that responsible practice means factoring into their care decisions a variable based on expected years of healthy and useful life that a patient might be expected to enjoy, rather than taking that person as a being of absolute and imprescriptive worth, as though persons too were commodities and existential interests were weighed in the same scale as the potatoes and tomatoes at the fairway down the street. Jewish obligations include ritual obligations, not just moral ones. We favor the moral ones, but the ritual ones are not unimportant. The reason, I think, is that ritual gives us a language in which to express our ideas about transcendence and gives us a vehicle for carrying our experience beyond the immediacy of the familiar and bringing back a sense of reaching and of groping and of pursuing something higher than ourselves, which infuses our lives morally and intellectually. The virtuous person, Maimonides makes this point in the 8 chapters. According to the philosophers, by which he means the Aristotelian tradition, the virtuous person is the person who feels comfortable and happy and derives pleasure from doing the right thing. There's another kind of person who does the right thing, but under a sense of constraint, and such a person is not as worthy. On the other hand, Maimonides says, in the Talmud we read that the reward is proportioned to the trouble that it involves. So the virtuous person who just naturally does the right thing and has made that a part of his character or her character is not on the same plane as the person who struggles and overcomes temptations. Maimonides distinguishes strictly moral acts from ceremonial or ritual acts in that regard. And he resolves that tension between the Aristotelian and Talmudic tradition in that way. He says, look, obviously a person who desires to do heinous and hideous things is not a good person. But the Talmud tells us that when you see your friend eating his ham sandwich, you're not supposed to say ugh. You're supposed to say that looks delicious, but I'm forbidden by God from enjoying it with you. That distinction between the moral and the ceremonial shows us that there's a dimension in which we can expand ourselves spiritually and intellectually through the symbolic expressions that philosophers like Suzanne Langer and Ernst Cassirer, her teacher, showed us are so important to us. There's a wonderful passage in Mary Douglas where she tells about the young priest coming to the elderly lady, elderly Catholic lady who has, all her life she has abstained from meat on Fridays, and the young priest tells her, you don't have to do that anymore. Well, that's a relic of the past. That's something, people used to do that. Eating fish on Fridays is no longer important to the doctrine of the church. And Mary Douglas, who's a very sensitive anthropologist and also a very sensitive Christian, notices that the young priest is kind of missing the point. This woman has found a vehicle for the expression of her spirituality. This matters to her, and because it matters to her, because it provides her a language for expressing her devotion and piety, it's an intrinsic part of her life. And that, I think, is part of what the Rambam is saying when he tells us, yes, in the ritual dimension, there's a symbolic mode, a mode that's expressive and that feeds back, that's not separated from the balance of our lives. Our ritual acts and omissions evince our recognition of the presence of God in our lives that gives us a language, because our thinking works so much through images and behaviors and language. It gives us a language in which to express our commitment and reinforce and direct and strengthen that commitment, dedicating and rededicating our lives to that kind of discovery. Let me start there. All right.
Thank you very much. Let's immediately get to some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I was hoping you might be able to speak to the kind of the pedagogic parameters about some of the last issues that you were talking about. And it seems to me they were a confluence of intentionality and action in both ritual and morality, and personal and communal. But that pedagogic component seems to be significant in your examples of the ham sandwich and the fish on Friday. So I'm hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
I see that you're a teacher yourself. Is that right? Yeah. I think you're bringing... Yeah, I think you're really bringing something important to this. The pedagogic here operates on a couple of levels. One is that the symbolism in which we act, I say it creates a language. Language, as Wittgenstein says, are social phenomena. We share a language. The language that we share unites us. We recognize one another's voices and one another's accents and one another's diction, and similarly with the rituals that we perform. Then there's the Aristotelian dimension of it, which is, Aristotle says that the most important task a society can pursue is that of education. And he doesn't mean 3 R's or math skills or what they teach you at Kumon or teach your kids at Kumon. He means the formation of character. The interesting thing that Aristotle recognizes is that character is formed through action. The dimension of that our tradition has been so sensitive to, and is certainly not alone in being sensitive to, is that those behaviors are often symbolic behaviors or have a symbolic dimension to them. So they become expressive of values. In God of Abraham, one of the books that Alan referred to, I speak about the laws of diet and sex, and the way in which we eat and the kinds of things that we eat, the kinds of animals that were offered as sacrifices in the temple. All those things convey a message. What were the animals that were offered in sacrifices in the temple? Lambs and goats and doves, not beasts of prey, not birds of prey, not scavengers, and we don't eat those things either. That tells you something about the linkage of our idea of purity, which has at one pole a ritual and symbolic dimension, and another pole a very earthy dimension. Our ideas of purity are oriented by our ideas of the ethos that we want to pursue, which is an Irenic ethos, a peaceful or peace-loving ethos. We don't always get that privilege, as we know, but that's what we're pursuing. So yes, it's educational in terms of what it wants to communicate to others about what we hold sacred, and it's educational in terms of how we inform our own character as individuals and as a community. I think you're absolutely right. Yes, please.
Yes. Could you address those elements of the tradition which challenge our refutation of Otto? We say the holy has to be united with the ethical, but then there is the theophany in the book of Job, which comes in response to Job's unanswered question about the injustice of the world. And there are the flashing out of something or other in response to Nadavani Abihu, and the Haftarah that's read next to him, Uzzah, as if the holiness that's in that divine sanctuary is like a high voltage electricity that you better not touch, or you really risk good or bad ethically, you risk your life by doing so.
Very challenging and important question. Let me start with the latter part, and then try the Book of Job, and obviously on one foot. But if you want to know more of my thoughts about the Book of Job, take a look at volume 25 in the Yale Judaica series, which is Saja Gaon's commentary on the Book of Job, which I sat at the feet of the great master Saja Gaon and learned from him one way of dealing with those issues, and I really commend that to you, because he's a great philologist as well as a great philosopher. The issue in Nadav and Avihu and other places, don't pass this line or you're going to get zapped. This expresses something that is very foreign to us, and I think it's very foreign to what the tradition has become. I see a progression here. It's not uniform and unitary all the way down. You can rationalize it, and I wouldn't be averse to doing that and saying, people aren't supposed to go there. That's in the 19th century, in the American Civil War, the word deadline did not mean a time that you weren't supposed to let pass. It meant a line that you weren't supposed to cross, and it was called a deadline because places like Andersonville Prison, they shoot you if you went across that line. That's why it was called the deadline. So it's not entirely foreign to the world we live in, but it is, as your question implies, very foreign to the way we read the tenor and thrust of the tradition, and I think that's okay. The Aron Kodesh is about to fall over, and somebody tries to keep it from falling, and like you said, high voltage, don't touch.
40 days if you drop a Sefer Torah.
Yeah, well, that's easy. That's easy because everybody knows, therefore, that you'd be very careful not to drop a Sefer Torah. That's a simple one, and that just tells you that Sefer Torah is a very holy object. But when you see these arbitrary eruptions, or what look to us, strange fire again, you get an explanation. So, all right, strange fire, they had it coming to them, but not going up the mountain, that sort of thing, very, very foreign to us. Let me take the more amenable, to me at least, philosophical end of your question, which is about the Book of Job. I dispute the idea implicit in your saying the injustice of the world. Injustices do occur, we all know that. But the idea that life is unfair, that that the world is unjust, this I would dispute. And I would dispute it in Maimonidean and indeed Sajjan terms. I mentioned one premise that you could take from Sajja on that point, that we didn't have anything coming to us in the first place, the way he would argue the point. So whatever you've got, you should be grateful and not look a gift horse in the mouth. I believe Alan and I were both present at Princeton when Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, made a similar point, and I responded to him that natural evils, which prey upon our vulnerability and our embodiment, are always parasitic upon the goods that we have. The life comes first. That's the big metaphysical point that our tradition wants to make. Yeah, illness is bad. We're not going to say it's good. We're not going to say that suffering is inherently meritorious. We're not going to agree with our Christian friends and neighbors that man by nature is damned or something like that. But we think that life is first, and what makes those evils evil is that they prey upon it. They attack it. There are earthquakes. And there is a way, like Voltaire did in regard to the earthquake in Lisbon in the 1750s, to show that he was more sensitive than the rest of the world. He's going to write a poem about the disaster in Lisbon, like the rest of the world couldn't appreciate and understand it if Voltaire didn't tell how terrible it was. People know how terrible things are. People know that disease is bad. But the reason it's bad is because we've got all this good. That's the important point to recognize. The good comes first. The good predominates. That doesn't mean that if you follow God's commands and you're a good person, that therefore you will be somehow guaranteed and protected, and you'll have this little loving cup placed over you. That's not the way the world works. If there is to be anything other than God, there are going to be finite beings. And finite beings are going to be in conflict with one another, and finite beings are going to be vulnerable. There will be death, there will be disease. We can combat those things. We don't have to talk ourselves into the idea that somehow we all had it coming, or that somehow this is really a good thing. So I hope that helps. Please.
Yeah, I guess I'm troubled, Glenn, by that last response when you're saying that a certain kind of idea that Rudolf Otto describes, I think, very, very well and very accurately, is foreign to us. You're saying that Vayikra, the very heart of the Torah, or to use my professional terminology, you're saying that priestly literature, which creates Torah, and also a great deal of prophetic literature, and also the book of Job. You're saying basically a heck of a lot of the Tanakh is foreign to us.
No, that's not what I said at all. No, please don't. I believe the question was divided into two parts. And with regard to the book of Job and Vayikra and so forth, I was in agreement. That's not foreign to us at all. What's foreign to us, what I find foreign, is the idea of an arbitrary eruption. Don't come in here because Hashem might erupt upon you. I can see it as a caution. I can see it as a warning, but I can't see it as an adequate portrayal of the nature of God. However,
but that portrayal of God that you're saying is foreign to us, that is the portrayal of God in a great deal of the Bible.
No, I disagree.
That's Job.
No, I really disagree. I do not think that's the point of Job. All right.
Follow up then. Part of this comes back to the issue of transcendence and holiness.
Sure.
I'd like to use a phrase that I'd like to put your feet to the fire on this. Coming from the biblical text, coming from classical Jewish texts, it seems to me that your equation of holiness with transcendence, from a biblical point of view, very consistently gets it exactly backwards. In the Tanakh, it is immanence that creates holiness. Holiness is all about immanence. Where is it in the Tanakh that we get the view that there is such a thing as makom kadosh, that there is sacred space, and there is even a kodesh kodashim in addition to the kodesh. It's precisely in the part of the Tanakh that is most of all about imminence. That is to say, the long narrative that goes from Exodus 25 through number 7, which is the narrative about how the kavod, how God's actual presence, left heaven and came to dwell on earth in a place called the Kodesh Kodashim. So what is it that makes Kodesh, that makes something holy? It's the actual literal presence of God. Conversely, and hence consistently, where is it in the Tanakh that we get the idea that no, God never comes to earth? It's in Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomic literature, where God is always only in heaven, God is always transcendent and never literally immanent. And it's precisely in that literature that we never, ever hear of the idea of an earthly thing that is holy. Deuteronomy never describes place as holy. This makes perfect sense. In the biblical view, it is God's presence that touches something and makes it kadosh. Therefore, those biblical texts that believe the one side of the great machloket of the Torah, the one side that thinks that God can be present on earth, thinks that things on earth can be kadosh. The other side of that machloket, which says, no, God is never present on earth, never, ever talks about an earthly thing.
Let me dispute your disputation. The manifestation of God's holiness on earth is exactly the resolution of the paradox that I'm talking about. So it doesn't count against my thesis at all. What you're doing is assuming the resolution of the paradox, the overcoming of the tension. Well, let me finish the answer. Let me finish answering it. If you take Kedusha in its etymological sense, of course there's a paradox, because Kedusha means what is set apart. But let me, as far as Deuteronomy is concerned, please, as far as Deuteronomy is concerned, the idea of holy places and holy things, yeah, that's not being used. But the idea of the immediacy of God's will and God's law in the passage that I cited, very famous passage, is very much present. That's how you bring holiness into your life. So if you see the Torah not as a machloket, but as a synthesis, the synthesis in Deuteronomy, the question is being answered, which was raised in Vayikra. In Vayikra, it tells you that you're supposed to be holy, because God is holy. And how are you supposed to do that? The rabbis ask that question, they answer it ethically. Now in Vayikra, that question is answered too, because that verse does not occur in isolation. It occurs in the whole complex of ethical and ritual obligations about Gilui Arayot and about all of the things that you're supposed to do, including V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That's the way you attain divine holiness, by not harboring a grudge, by not by not thinking that it's tactful to avoid reproving your neighbor, and so forth. So you get very concrete implementation of how you become holy. You can take that achievement as being done and say you've got an identity there. I see that identity in God, but that's what's being made clear to people when those passages are revealed. In Deuteronomy, that's spelled out much further in terms of the immediacy of. If I could say so. No, what you're doing, it seems to.
You're right about Vayikra, but Deuteronomy, that's exactly what Deuteronomy does.
It seems to me that if you take the layering of the biblical text, which is a historical probability, as indicative of a dispute and a disagreement, a radical dissensus about the nature of God, which is the way biblical critics tend to read. You know, they look for a distinction and they find a dispute, because then they can find development and they can show this is this and that is that. You can get that kind of result. If you look at the Torah as combining these ideas, because after all, Vayikra and Devarim are in the same book. We put them together. So I'm reading them that way. I'm seeing these divisions as overcome. The overcoming that I'm referring to, however, is the overcoming of the idea of separateness, and all of the instances that you mentioned, where God's holiness becomes manifest on earth, is precisely the kind of evidence that I'm referring to.
Vayikra never talks about God's holiness being manifest on earth. Vayikra talks about God
What is Beit HaMikdash? What is the Mishkan?
Beit HaMikdash never occurred because the term doesn't occur.
That's true. That's true. But the term that does occur in the Chumash is the Mishkan. Now, Mishkan, excuse me, it does not. I think that it's very commonplace to translate Shekhinah as God's presence.
No.
I translated it as, in this paper, I translated it as God's manifestation. It seems to be that the word Shekhinah is cognate with the Greek skena, what appears. Yeah, I think so. Well, we'll have to arm wrestle over this.
We're sort of out of time, but this is a very, very significant dispute. May be the wrong term for it. This is a very significant debate, and it's a machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven. And
There's a dispute over the proper naming of heaven.
Yes. My first thought was that our philosopher guest, doing a kind of philosophical, theological presentation of Scripture, Chazal, Judaism, has run into the buzzsaw of JTS historicism. But I realized this is wrong. This is not right at all. There's one theological project going on here, and there's another theological project going on here. There's a fundamental dispute about what to do with the heterogeneity of these ancient traditions. How high a level of integration can they sustain without losing what one of our theologians thinks is crucial, or if you don't achieve that integration, then you lose what the whole thing is about. So there's something very, very important going on here, and I hope we can make it go on in a way that doesn't require us to go past 1:30 today. At least we don't have a fire drill prematurely terminating this like we had last time. Before we thank Professor Goodman, let me just mention, you'll get an email about this shortly, but next semester we also have a series of speakers. These are somewhat more people who think of themselves, I'd say, more overtly as theologians. On February 3rd, we'll have Art Green. I'm not quite sure what he's going to talk about yet. We haven't gotten a title, but it's probably about his book, Radical Judaism, which is very mystical. On March 10th, we'll have David Novak, and on March 31st, we'll have Yitz Greenberg, who'll be talking about covenant and pluralism. And these will all be on Thursdays rather than Wednesdays, which I hope will be more accommodating for many here in the building. Okay, so let's thank Professor Goodman once again.